you very much for the introduction, and thanks to the organizers, thanks to Kevin and Dalia for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be here to discuss something which is actually very close to my heart, both as an academic and as an activist in Southeast Asia. I don't know why everyone is sitting as far from me as possible. I did brush my teeth this morning, I assure you. Let's begin with the title. What I'd like to talk about, which is basically the need for us in Southeast Asia to somehow reconnect with our history, but when even phrasing that, to talk about it as our history, that raises precisely the problems that I'd like to address in a short space of time given to me. I deliberately started off with the word name signifier Singhapura. And the reason for that is simply because I think we today in Southeast Asia live in a region where the logic of the nation state has become sedimented and hegemonized to the point where our national identities, and by virtue of that our individual identities, are likewise configured by notions of citizenship and a very specific sense of political, cultural, historical belonging to places. But of course, when we look at the map of Southeast Asia today, it is a very novel development in the history of a region that has a history that goes back to at least 4,000 years. And any historian will tell you that the lines that we see on the map are completely artificial lines that have been drawn in a very arbitrary manner, in some cases leading to trauma, sense of division, sense of loss. In other cases, same issues therefore serving as a pretext for all sorts of claims that are constantly being made, and the claims range from claims of territoriality, language, culture, etc., etc. This is a very interesting region for that, simply because despite its evident constructiveness, despite its evident newness, Southeast Asia as we know it today is a very new thing in the history of the world, in human history. Despite that, we live on a day-by-day basis as if these novel inventions have been there since time immemorial. And so I'm always fascinated by the politics of name, the politics of naming, because of course to name a place is not simply giving that patch of earth a certain sense of cohesion and giving it some solidity, but of course it's also a claim. To name a place is to claim that place. America, of course, was not named America before the advent of Western colonization, and prior to that, that part of the world did not have that name. All these contingent facts of history somehow, with the passing of time, sediment and solidify. And upon that completely contingent, arbitrary basis, our identities are constructed and subsequently become equally sedimented and solidifying. And yet, as both a political analyst and a political historian, I find it necessary for us to constantly interrogate the language that we use to describe ourselves and our sense of belonging. And that's why so much of the work that I do, I call myself a political historian, but I'm basically a deconstructive historian. What I try to do all the time is write a sort of history, and this refers to the text that was mentioned earlier, the other Malaysia, write a history that is deconstructed. Deconstructive history in the sense that I write a history to demonstrate the constructiveness of objects, be they states, nation states, be they communities, be they names, just to demonstrate the fact that there has never been a linear deterministic history, despite the fact that all of us, like it or not, are being swept along with the wave of time. So let's start with Singhapura. We're talking about a very, very distant place, very far from us today. I believe it was Louis Stevenson who said, time is the greatest distance between two places. And in that respect, when we talk of Singhapura and the region where Singhapura was located, we're talking about a very different place. Very far from us today. Very far from us today. Temporarily, very far from us today. And it's interesting how, in our attempts to connect wittingly or unwittingly, all sorts of narratives pop out. I'll give you an example. It's interesting that we're having this talk here at the library today, whereas you know there is an exhibition on William Farquhar outside. I recall meeting a group of school kids here, just outside the Asian Civilizations Museum. They were a bit bemused by the statue of Stamford Raffles, particularly because there were two. I've never understood why there are two statues of Stamford Raffles. So I asked them, who is this man? And they were all a bit shy at the beginning. And then one kid, a fat little kid, said, he's the one who founded Singapore. So I said, can you tell me how Singapore was founded then? And so he gave me this story. Because apparently there was a man by the name of Mr. Raffles, and he was traveling on a ship. And on his ship there was a lion. And he stopped at this island, and the lion escaped. So he went on, he got off the boat, landed on the island, looked for his lion, couldn't find it, but he liked the island, so he stayed on the island, and then he called the island Singapore to remind him of the lion that he lost. I thought that was a wonderful story. It's a wonderful story, and we should collect these stories simply because they tell us so much about our sense of grappling with the present and the past. I then, of course, disillusioned the boys. Raffles was a pirate, actually, and actually that may have made him like Raffles even more. I find this interesting simply because we live in a present-day Southeast Asia where like the rest of the world, we are all completely wired up and globalized. And one of the aspects of globalization, I suppose, is this sense of living in the immediate present. We live, as it's been said many times, I'm not the first person to say this, say many times that we live in an age where everyone has a 3-minute memory that lasts about as long as a pop video on MTV. And living as we do in this immediate present all the time, we nonetheless have to grapple with the past that constantly, surreptitiously, returns again and again in a sort of reenactment of the return of the repressed to haunt us in the immediate present. I find this interesting because this problematic of identifying Singapore and Singhapura is not, of course, unique to Singapore. It exists throughout Southeast Asia. I'm finishing a book now on the state of Pahang in Malaysia as a short historical monograph, which I call it Deconstructive History of Pahang. I'm not writing about Pahang as a state in Malaysia. I'm talking about Pahang as an idea. And in the course of doing so, of course, all academics, especially historians, when we write books, we have to read other books, so we read in order to write, and plagiarism is part and parcel of our task. We get paid to plagiarize. And in the course of reading what has been written about Pahang, I was struck by one simple observation, that in almost none of the books that I read, be they the books written during the colonial or post-colonial era, in none of the historical accounts of the state of Pahang, which is the biggest state in the Malaysian Peninsula today, in none of the accounts of the history of Pahang is there a mention of two historical erasures. The first is the fact that long before even the name Pahang emerged, that patch of earth was home to various polities, various societies, including a very interesting polity, a Hindu-Buddhist polity known as Takula, which was said to lie where the basin of the Kuantan River is today. There's almost no mention of that. And of course, the second erasure, which I think is even more serious and even more damaging, is the failure to mention the fact that long before the emergence of Pahang as a Malay-Muslim polity from the late 15th, early 16th century onwards, Pahang emerged at the same time as Perak and other Malay polities. Long before that, for at least 25,000 years, that patch of earth was home to various communities who we today refer to as the original people, the Orang Asli, who had developed political economic systems which have never been officially recorded in the official history of Malaysia. And yet it is interesting that as Pahang began to emerge in the late 15th and early 16th century, the early rulers of Pahang, the Malay chieftains, all claimed some sort of genealogical legacy to the Orang Asli communities, because this claim of genealogy became the basis of a claim to A, rule, and B, belong. And yet the enormous and important contribution and presence of these Orang Asli communities is never there, has never been there, be it during the colonial period or in the post-colonial period. And what we see today, and this is one of the conclusions I come up with,